Book review: The British Imagination by Peter Watson. Peter Watson's The British Imagination is panoramic, deeply ambitious work that seeks to answer deceptively simple question. How did relatively insignificant island on the fringes of Europe transform itself over the course of 500 years into one of the most culturally and intellectually dominant powers the world has ever seen? The subtitle of the book might well have been How Britain Came to Think Itself into Being, because what Watson presents is not merely political or economic history, but rigorous intellectual and cultural cartography of British development. Beginning with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I in 1558, Watson traces the major philosophical, scientific, literary, religious, and commercial threads that, when interwoven, form the fabric of British identity and exceptionalism. What emerges is not a story of linear progress or simplistic triumphalism, but deeply textured account of struggle, curiosity, pragmatism, dissent, and creativity. The result is a book that is both enlightening and provocative, expansive and detailed, illuminating not only how Britain rose, but also how it imagined and reimagined itself across centuries. Plot summary: Peter Watson's The British Imagination is an ambitious and richly detailed exploration of how Britain transformed from an isolated medieval backwater into global intellectual and cultural powerhouse over the last 5 centuries. Watson weaves together the disciplines of science, philosophy, literature, religion, commerce, and imperial ambition to show how Britain forged its national identity and carved a distinctive role for itself. World history, with sweeping historical range and meticulous attention to detail, the book reveals how British creativity, grounded in pragmatism and driven by curiosity, has shaped not just the nation, but the modern world. The book begins by establishing the stagnant position of pre-Elizabethan Britain. Before the 16th century, the British Isles were politically fragmented, economically modest, and intellectually peripheral. While the Renaissance had already flourished and the Islamic world boasted advanced centers of learning, Britain lagged behind. This began to change dramatically with the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Watson argues that her era marked cultural and intellectual renaissance, catalyzed by relatively stable monarchy, the rise of Protestantism, and nascent spirit of exploration and inquiry. One of the earliest focal points in this cultural awakening was literature, Shakespeare occupying central place in Watson's narrative. For Watson, Shakespeare's genius is not only literary but intellectual. His work encapsulates the complexity of the human condition, the ambiguity of truth, and the interplay between individual agency and social order. These themes would echo throughout British thought in the centuries to follow. Another key turning point was the rise of empirical science. The formation of the Royal Society in 1660 marked the formalization of a British scientific method grounded in observation, experimentation, and skepticism. Watson highlights figures like Isaac Newton, whose revolutionary work in physics and mathematics not only advanced scientific understanding but helped shape the Enlightenment itself. This empirical tradition, Watson argues, differentiated Britain from the more theoretical and metaphysical approaches of continental Europe. Watson also traces how religious transformation contributed to the shaping of the British imagination. The Reformation, though tumultuous, gave rise to the distinctly British Protestant ethic, one that emphasized individual conscience, personal reading, scripture, and questioning of centralized authority. This ethic helped cultivate culture of dissent and debate, which became vital for both political evolution and intellectual innovation. The long tradition of nonconformism and dissenters, many of whom were excluded from elite universities, led to parallel institutions of learning and creativity, fostering rich diversity of thought. Commerce and capitalism also play a pivotal role in Watson's account. The growth of trade and the rise of wealthy mercantile class created both the means and the motivation for innovation. Britain's naval dominance allowed for global exploration and colonial expansion, which in turn brought wealth, new ideas, and raw materials back to the metropole. Watson acknowledges the moral complexity of empire but emphasizes that the imperial project, integral to the British identity, not merely for material reasons, but also as crucible for experimentation in governance, science, and culture. The Industrial Revolution was perhaps the most transformative event in Watson's chronology. More than a shift in economic production, it represented reimagining of how society could function. Technological breakthroughs from the steam engine to mechanized textiles were accompanied by new philosophies of human progress and labor. Watson links this period with key intellectuals such as Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, whose ideas about economics and utilitarian ethics reshaped public discourse. The explosion of innovation also fueled sense of British exceptionalism, belief in Britain's civilizing mission and its ability to shape global destiny. Parallel to these material and scientific developments was the flourishing of British literature and philosophy. Watson devotes considerable attention to writers such as Samuel Johnson, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Virginia Woolf. These figures, he argues, represent not merely aesthetic milestones but philosophical ones. British literature consistently explored questions of morality, identity, freedom, and the individual's role. Society, Woolf's stream of consciousness modernism, for example, is seen not just as stylistic innovation but as philosophical challenge to traditional narratives of time, memory, and self. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, British global power reached its zenith. The empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface, and the British imagination stretched to accommodate the new political and moral responsibilities that came with this dominance. Watson does away from the darker legacies of empire, racism, exploitation, and cultural erasure. But he also notes that Britain's exposure to diverse cultures and challenges spurred new intellectual responses. Figures like Charles Darwin, whose Origin of Species reshaped biology and theology alike, emerged in context of global curiosity and confrontation with the unknown. Watson is especially interested in the tension between conservatism, innovation that defines British culture. The British imagination, he argues, is fundamentally empirical, skeptical, and pragmatic, but also capable of great leaps in artistic and philosophical creativity. It is this combination that enabled the country to weather revolutions, adapt to global change, and continue to generate influential ideas well into the 20th century. By the end of the book, Watson brings the narrative into the modern era, acknowledging Britain's diminished geopolitical role, but also asserting the continued vitality of its cultural and intellectual life. Post-imperial Britain, he suggests, remains hub of creativity from the experiments of post-war authors to the scientific advancements of British Nobel laureates. Even amid the uncertainties of Brexit and the decline of global influence, the British imagination continues to reassert itself in new forms. In conclusion, the British imagination is sweeping and illuminating chronicle of 5 centuries of cultural and intellectual transformation. Peter Watson convincingly argues that Britain's rise to global prominence was not merely a matter of military might or colonial wealth, but the product of distinctive thinking, empirical questioning, moral, and inventive. By connecting the dots between Shakespeare and Darwin, Newton and Woolf, Watson shows how Britain's intellectual DNA has left an indelible mark on the modern world. The book is both celebration and critical reflection on what it means to think and be British, from obscurity to intellectual powerhouse. Watson opens with striking contrast. Pre-Elizabethan Britain was political backwater, lacking the sophistication of Renaissance Italy, the exploratory ambitions of Spain and Portugal, or the centralized authority of France. But with Elizabeth's reign came flowering of the arts and ideas as the Protestant Reformation loosened the grip of the Catholic Church and opened intellectual channels that had long been stifled. Watson's first major claim is that Britain's rise can be directly tied to its embrace of ideas, and particularly the empirical spirit that came to define so much of its scientific and philosophical output. One of the central figures in this early modern explosion of thought is William Shakespeare, whom Watson rightly places at the heart of the British imagination. Far from being merely literary giant, Shakespeare is presented as moral philosopher, dramatist. A certainty and chronicler of the human condition, his place reflects shifting worldview. One no longer anchored in religious certainty but grappling with individual agency, moral ambiguity, and political complexity. Shakespeare's influence was not only cultural but epistemological. He helped set the stage quite literally for national conversation about truth, power, and identity. The empirical turn. Perhaps the most consequential development in Watson's narrative is the emergence of empirical science as cornerstone of British thought. The establishment of the Royal Society in 1660 symbolized the institutionalization of a uniquely British approach to knowledge, grounded in observation, driven by experimentation, and wary of dogma. Watson explores how figures like Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and especially Isaac Newton revolutionized not only science but the very idea of truth. Newton's work, which revealed the underlying laws of nature, was both humbling and empowering. It suggested that the universe was noble, governed by rules, and accessible to human reason. What distinguished British empiricism from continental rationalism, Watson argues, was its pragmatic spirit. Where Descartes sought certainty through introspective logic, British thinkers like John Locke emphasized experience, perception, and incremental learning. This philosophical divergence had lasting consequences. It shaped educational systems, legal traditions, and even political ideologies. The empirical tradition fostered an attitude of cautious optimism and commitment to progress through observation and reform, not revolution. Religion and the culture of dissent. Religion occupies a central and complicated role in the British imagination. Watson does not ignore the violence and division of the Reformation, but he argues that Protestantism, and especially the individualist ethos of the dissenting sects, played a crucial role in shaping British intellectual life. The Reformation, particularly in its more radical expressions, emphasized personal reading of scripture, resistance, centralized religious authority, and the primacy of conscience. These values translated into broader culture of questioning, debate, and moral independence. Dissenters, often barred from traditional institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, created their own schools, networks, and literary circles. This decentralization fostered innovation and plurality of viewpoints. Watson draws direct line from religious dissent to later political liberalism, abolitionism, and even feminism. Indeed, the nonconformist spirit becomes kind of through line in British history. Source of tension, but also of remarkable creativity. Commerce, capitalism, and empire. Watson devotes considerable attention to commerce and capitalism, recognizing them as both engines and expressions of the British imagination. The rise of robust merchant class, centered in London and provincial port cities, created not only wealth but new kind of cosmopolitan sensibility. Trade required navigation, calculation, diplomacy, and risk, qualities that filtered into literature, science, and philosophy. The East India Company, for instance, was not merely an economic juggernaut. It was a cultural institution, bringing back knowledge, languages, and contradictions from across the globe. Empire, of course, casts long and ambiguous shadow over the narrative. Watson does not shy away from the exploitative and often brutal nature of colonialism, but he insists that it was integral to the development of British identity. Empire provided stage on which the British imagination could both expand and be tested. It prompted new inquiries into race, governance, economics, and morality. Figures like Edmund Burke and later George Orwell wrestled with the moral cost of imperial ambition, revealing the tensions at the heart of British self-perception. Watson notes that by the 1920s, Britain had colonized a quarter of the globe, an astonishing feat by any measure. But more remarkable, he suggests, is how the British justified, resisted, and narrated that power. The imagination of empire was not singular. It was contested and refracted through novels, treatises, scientific journals, and political debates. This plurality of voices is what makes British intellectual history so compelling and so challenging. Literature is a moral laboratory. One of the great strengths of Watson's book is his sustained attention to literature as vehicle for moral and philosophical inquiry. From Samuel Johnson to Virginia Woolf, British writers have not merely reflected their times but shaped them. Johnson, with his moral clarity and love of language, emerges as transitional figure between Enlightenment and Romanticism. Jane Austen's novels, often underestimated for domestic focus, are reinterpreted as acute examinations of ethics, class, and personal freedom. Dickens, Eliot, Hardy, all are treated not only as artists but as moral thinkers, deeply engaged with the social and psychological complexities of their era. Watson is particularly insightful on Woolf, whom he positions as bridge to modernism and herald of the introspective turn in British thought. Her stream of consciousness technique, far from being an aesthetic flourish, is presented as philosophical challenge to Enlightenment rationalism. Woolf's characters do not act according to reason or duty alone. They experience time, memory, and emotion in fractured, deeply subjective ways. In this sense, British literature becomes laboratory for understanding the self, the other, and the society they inhabit. Science, progress, and modernity. As the narrative moves into the 19th and 20th centuries, Watson continues to highlight the interplay between science and culture. The Industrial Revolution, fueled by coal, steam, and steel, is not treated simply as an economic event, but as an epistemic shift. Technologies like the railway and telegraph transformed human perceptions of time, space, and causality. Darwin's theory of evolution, perhaps disruptive idea of the 19th century, challenged religious dogma and anthropocentric assumptions. Watson places Darwin alongside Newton and Shakespeare as one of the architects of the modern British imagination. The 20th century poses new challenges. 2 world wars, the decline of empire, the rise of mass media, and the fracturing of consensus. Yet Watson maintains that the core elements of the British imagination, empiricism, dissent, inquiry, and literary richness, remain intact. Even amid decline, Britain continued to produce thinkers, writers, and scientists of global stature. Watson points to figures like Bertrand Russell, George Orwell, and the Nobel laureates in science as evidence that Britain's intellectual vitality did not fade with its imperial power. Strengths and critiques. What makes the British imagination such compelling read is its sheer breadth. Watson is master synthesizer, able to move fluently from Newton's optics to Eliot's moral philosophy, from Locke's empiricism to the aesthetics of Turner. He is unafraid to draw bold connections, and while not every link is erudite, the overall architecture of the book is impressive. However, the book is not without its flaws. One might argue that Watson has sufficient attention to the contributions of women, minorities, and colonized voices in shaping the British imagination. While figures like Mary Wollstonecraft and Woolf are discussed, the narrative often centers on elite, male white voices. Post-colonial thinkers, Black British writers, and working-class intellectuals are sometimes marginalized or mentioned in passing. In books so concerned with dissent and pluralism, this is a surprising omission. Similarly, the can occasionally feel like celebration of British exceptionalism without enough critical interrogation. While Watson does address the moral costs of empire and the limitations of British liberalism, he sometimes leans too heavily on great men and great ideas framework, more thorough engagement with structural inequalities within Britain and across the empire would have added valuable complexity. Inclusion, a nation imagined again and again. Despite these limitations, the British imagination is an extraordinary achievement. It offers compelling account of how small a nation came to think of itself and be thought of as world leader not just in power, but in ideas. By tracing the threads of science, religion, literature, commerce, and dissent, Watson paints a portrait of national character that is at once skeptical and ambitious, empirical, visionary in an age of uncertainty about Britain's place in the world. Post-Brexit, post-empire, and post-industrial, this book serves as a powerful reminder of the ideas that once propelled the nation forward, whether those ideas still hold sway, and whether the British imagination can continue to inspire and globalize a fractured world remains an open question. But thanks to Watson's thoughtful, wide-ranging work, readers are better equipped to ask it.